It was Christmas Eve, and the streets were eerily quiet. Soft snowflakes fell from the dark sky, covering the rooftops and balconies with a delicate white blanket. Inside her small apartment, Emily finished wrapping a loaf of fresh bread. She had spent the evening baking, trying to distract herself from the loneliness of the season. But her thoughts kept drifting to Mrs. Grace, the elderly woman who lived upstairs with her cat. Emily didn't know much about her. The woman rarely left her apartment and avoided talking to the neighbors. Still, there was something about Mrs. Grace's isolation that tugged at Emily's heart. It didn't feel right that someone should spend Christmas alone, even if they preferred it that way. Clutching the bread tightly, Emily walked up the stairs, each creak of the old wood echoing in the silence. She hesitated in front of the door, unsure if she should knock. Her hand hovered for a moment before she finally tapped gently. No response. She tried again. Louder this time, the sound of shuffling footsteps reached her ears, and the door cracked open. There stood Mrs. Grace, her frail frame barely visible in the dim light of the hallway. Her face was lined with years of weariness, and her eyes, though sharp, carried an undeniable sadness. Behind her, a curious cat peeked out, its tail flicking as it studied Emily. "Good evening," Emily said softly, smiling. "I baked this and thought you might like some. Merry Christmas." Mrs. Grace didn't speak at first. Her hand, resting on the edge of the door, trembled slightly. For a moment, Emily thought she might refuse, but then the elderly woman nodded slowly and took the loaf without meeting Emily's eyes. "Thank you," Mrs. Grace murmured, her voice hoarse, as though she hadn't spoken in days. Emily hesitated. "I don't mean to intrude, but is there anything you need? Anything I can help with?" Mrs. Grace shook her head quickly, her body stiffening. Yet she didn't close the door. The cat, bolder than its owner, stepped forward, brushing against Emily's leg and letting out a small meow. Emily chuckled. "Well, he seems happy to see me, at least." Mrs. Grace's lips twitched as though she might smile, but she caught herself. She gestured faintly toward the hallway. "It's late. You should get back before it gets colder." Emily nodded, sensing she shouldn't push further. "Of course. Merry Christmas, Mrs. Grace, and thank you for opening the door." The older woman didn't reply, but as she gently closed the door, Emily caught a glimpse of her staring down at the bread with a thoughtful expression. The small act might not have meant much, but it was a start. As Emily walked back down the stairs, she resolved to try again. Everyone deserved a little kindness, especially during Christmas. The following morning, Emily woke up with a sense of purpose. She couldn't shake the image of Mrs. Grace standing in that dim doorway, clutching the loaf of bread, as if it were the first kindness she had received in years. Emily didn't know the woman's story, but something told her it wasn't a happy one. After a quick breakfast, Emily packed a small basket with a few items she thought Mrs. Grace might need: some fresh fruit, cookies, and a warm scarf. She'd knitted a few winters ago but never used. She wasn't sure if Mrs. Grace would accept the gesture, but Emily was determined to try. As she climbed the creaking stairs again, she rehearsed what to say, unsure if she would even be welcome this time. When she knocked, the door opened a little quicker than before. Mrs. Grace appeared, her pale face framed by the faint light spilling out from the hallway behind her. "Good morning," Emily greeted with a gentle smile. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I brought a few things I thought you might like." Mrs. Grace's eyes dropped to the basket, and for a moment her expression softened. She didn't speak, but she stepped aside, wordlessly inviting Emily in. Emily entered carefully. Taking in the small apartment for the first time, it was cramped, with stacks of old newspapers and books covering almost every surface. The air was heavy, carrying the scent of dust and time. Still, there was a sense of warmth in the clutter, as though it were a refuge rather than a prison. "Thank you, Mrs. Grace said after a long silence, her voice still quiet but more steady than the night before. "You didn't have to go through the trouble." "It's no trouble," Emily replied, setting the basket down on a small table. "And it's the least I could do. Christmas is a time for sharing, isn't it?" The older woman gave a faint smile, almost imperceptible as her cat, now officially the boldest in the room, jumped onto Emily's lap as if he had known her forever. "Toby seems to like you," Mrs. Grace said, her tone softening as she watched the scene. Emily laughed. "He's the real reason I keep coming back. I think he and I are already best friends." Mrs. Grace sat down slowly, her frail hands resting on her knees. She looked at the basket, then at Emily, as though trying to decide if she could trust this stranger who had suddenly appeared in her quiet world. "Why are you doing this?" she asked finally, her voice filled with both curiosity and doubt. Emily hesitated for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Because no one should be alone at Christmas, and I guess I just felt like you might need someone to remind you of that." Mrs. Grace didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached out and gently stroked Toby's fur, her gaze distant. "It's been a long time since anyone cared enough to remind me of anything," she murmured. Emily stayed a little longer, talking about light-hearted things, the snow outside, her clumsy attempts at baking, and how Toby seemed to be the boss of the apartment. Though Mrs. Grace said little, she seemed to relax as the minutes passed, the tension in her shoulders easing. When Emily finally stood to leave, she looked at Mrs. Grace with a warm smile. "I'll stop by again soon if that's okay. Maybe we can share some tea next time." Mrs. Grace hesitated, then nodded ever so slightly. "That might be nice." As Emily descended the stairs, she felt a quiet joy settle in her chest. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. A few days later, Emily returned, this time with a small tin of cookies and a plan to stay a little longer. She had noticed during her last visit that Mrs. Grace seemed to respond to the simple, quiet moments of connection. It wasn't about grand gestures, it was about being present. When she knocked, Mrs. Grace opened the door almost immediately. Toby was at her feet, his tail flicking lazily. "You're back," Mrs. Grace said, her voice softer than Emily expected. "I told you I'd bring tea," Emily replied, holding up a small bag of chamomile. Mrs. Grace gave a brief nod and stepped aside this time. The apartment felt a little less heavy. The clutter was still there, but the air seemed lighter. Emily noticed that a corner of the table had been cleared, and for the first time it felt like Mrs. Grace was preparing for her visits. As Emily set the cookies and tea on the table, she glanced at the stacks of old books. One caught her eye, a faded leather cover with delicate gold lettering. "You have quite the collection," Emily remarked, running her fingers lightly over the spine of the book. Mrs. Grace followed her gaze and gave a small smile. "I've always loved stories. They kept me company when life felt too quiet." Emily poured the tea into two mismatched cups and handed one to Mrs. Grace. "I think stories are meant to do that," she said thoughtfully. "They remind us that we're never truly alone." Mrs. Grace stared at the tea, her hands trembling slightly as she held the cup. "There was a time when I wasn't alone," she said softly. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the weight of her words filled the room. Emily didn't speak, sensing that this was a moment Mrs. Grace needed to guide. "I had a son," she continued, her gaze fixed on Toby, who was curled up on the chair beside her. "He was the light of my life, but I lost him on Christmas Eve." Emily felt her breath catch in her throat. She didn't move, afraid that any reaction might disrupt the fragile thread of trust Mrs. Grace was offering. "He was only 9, Mrs. Grace went on, her voice cracking. "It was an accident. One moment he was there, laughing and full of life, and the next, he was gone." The silence that followed was thick and heavy. But Emily didn't rush to fill it. She let Mrs. Grace sit with her grief, her tears falling quietly as she stroked Toby's fur. "I stopped celebrating Christmas after that," Mrs. Grace admitted after a long pause. "What was the point? It just reminded me of everything I'd lost." Emily reached out, her hand resting lightly on Mrs. Grace's arm. "I can't imagine that kind of pain," she said gently. "But I do know this. Your son wouldn't want you to live in darkness forever, maybe. Maybe this Christmas can be a small step back toward the light." Mrs. Grace didn't respond, but she didn't pull away either. Toby let out a soft purr, his presence comforting in the stillness of the room. Emily stayed for a while longer, talking about small things and sharing quiet moments over tea. When she finally stood to leave, Mrs. Grace surprised her. "Thank you, Emily," she said, her voice steady despite the tears still glistening in her eyes. "For reminding me that there's still some good left in the world," Emily smiled, feeling a warmth she hadn't expected. "I'll see you soon, and next time maybe we can add something to that corner, something small, just to brighten it up." Mrs. Grace gave a hesitant nod, and for the first time, Emily saw the faintest flicker of hope in her eyes. On Christmas Eve, Emily decided to do something special. She wanted Mrs. Grace to feel that this holiday could still hold some warmth. Even if only in small ways, she prepared a tiny wreath adorned with ribbons and brought it up to her neighbor's door along with a modest candle. This time, Mrs. Grace opened the door before Emily even had a chance to knock. It was clear she'd been waiting. Toby, ever the curious one, darted out briefly before circling back to his favorite spot near Emily's feet. "I thought you might enjoy a little more holiday spirit," Emily said, holding up the wreath and candle. "Just something small to brighten the evening." Mrs. Grace hesitated, her gaze lingering on the wreath. Then, to Emily's surprise, she stepped aside and motioned her in with a quiet nod. Inside, the apartment felt different. The cluttered table was now neatly arranged, and a corner of the room was almost bare, except for a few old photographs Emily hadn't noticed before. Mrs. Grace gestured toward them. "I thought it might be time to bring these out again," she said quietly. "They've been packed away for so long." Emily walked over and saw the smiling face of a young boy. His joy seemed frozen in time, captured in those worn-out photographs. Next to them was a small wooden box. "He loved Christmas," Mrs. Grace murmured, her voice trembling. "I didn't think I could ever let myself remember those moments again, but maybe it's time I stop hiding from them." Emily placed the wreath near the photos and lit the candle, its soft glow casting a warm light over the room. "He'd be happy to know you're thinking of him like this," Emily said gently. Mrs. Grace nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. "You've done so much for me, Emily." "I didn't think anyone cared anymore," Emily smiled. "Sometimes we just need someone to remind us that we're not invisible, and you're not." "Mrs. Grace, you're here, you matter." The two sat in quiet companionship, sipping tea and watching the candle flicker. Toby, ever the guardian, curled up between them, purring contentedly. When Emily finally left that night, Mrs. Grace stood at the door longer than usual, watching her go for the first time in years. She felt the faint stirrings of hope as the candle burned softly in her apartment. Mrs. Grace looked at the photographs once more. "Merry Christmas," she whispered, feeling as though those words finally belonged in her world again. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to click the card above to enjoy more tales filled with emotion and humanity. Subscribe to the channel, give us a like and share your comments. I love reading them and seeing how these stories impact your lives. Thank you for being part of this community.